use my words a lot, physics a force that they can't stop. They just don't get it, I think they forget I'm not done till I'm on top. I know I was born for this. I know I was born for this. I believe we can write our story.
Hey everyone, how you doing? Hey, hop a day, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, all the above. It's Gary Wise here, Wise Leadership Solutions, with another Words from Wise. Today I got a special guest who, I don't know if he remembers the first time we met each other in person, but I do. So I'm going to introduce him to the stage. Uh, he is a retired Navy Master Chief Petty Officer. He's doing great things. He is Mr. Brian Ortega. Brian, what's up, man?
Hey, good afternoon, Gary. Good, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, man.
Let's
So do
go.
you remember when we first met in person?
I did after you reminded me of what it was, and that was actually had some fun at those events.
When are you talking about?
You talked about when we did briefly talk during one of the Force Mass Chiefs hoo-yahs that he was doing.
No, actually before that. Uh, so I'm pretty sure when I first got to a float training group San Diego, I feel like you were my CMC, bro.
I was there from 14 to 17.
And I missed you. Then no, it was
Yeah,
at that Purpose Force event that we spoke in person, but I could have
yeah.
swore we crossed paths there. So, all right, Brian. So you joined the United States Navy, or where'd you come from before you joined the service, bro?
I was born and raised in Norwalk, California.
Where's Norwalk at? Is that like Southern California, like
Yeah, it's
LA
like
area?
right by Knott's Berry Farm, Angel Stadium. I mean, right in that
Okay,
area.
so that Anaheim area, right around there.
Yeah. Anaheim, Cerritos, Downey, La Mirada.
Okay, so growing up in Southern California, man, how was that for you? Was Cali? Because you still live in Cali, right?
I do, yeah, I do.
How much
I'm about
different?
an hour north of San Diego now, in
Okay,
the
how much
Temecula,
different?
Murrieta, Lake Elsinore area.
Okay, so I got it like that. Uh, I was gonna say Hemet, but not Hemet.
Yeah,
What's
right
that
there.
area?
Yeah,
Is
it's
that
right there.
Hemet?
Yeah,
Okay, got
Hammond, Menifee. I mean, all those cities are like, close to each other.
Okay, so how much different is California now than what it was like for you growing up as a kid and as a teenager? Is it the same? Has it changed a lot?
Probably a lot more crazies, I guess. Because it was pretty chill, pretty, easy going growing up.
Yeah,
And now you gotta kind of watch yourself and that type of stuff. But there's bad places everywhere you go.
that's true. I remember living in California. There's nothing but good things, really, except for the cost of the sunshine tax, right? But other than that, it was a beautiful place to live. The water was cold there compared to like Florida, right? Here in Florida, the water is very warm, like on the Gulf side.
Yeah,
Um,
nothing
but
like the
that was a
Guam
beautiful.
water though.
That's a whole different conversation, bro. We'll get into Guam. Guam was beautiful water too, though. That was hard to beat for sure. Uh, what made you coming up through high school, looking at your life? What made you decide to look at the service as a possible option?
Well, I had some friends that had joined. I had some friends who left, and they were able to secure houses and through the V, through the VA and all that stuff, and it seemed like a good avenue at the time. I tried the JC route, doing that stuff, and things just didn't finish for me there. So I decided to try something new.
Okay, so you got out of high school and you actually went to college for a little bit, and then that
Yeah.
just wasn't for you.
Well, it just, with work and how the things were going, things were going at the time. It was just easier to just say, hey, these guys are doing some stuff out there. I'm going to see if I can't follow them a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Did you have family support when you thought about joining the service?
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. Because some people they'll go tell their parents or whoever, hey, I think we'll join the military, and they'd be like, "What? You're gonna leave forever? What are you thinking?" Right?
Now they probably, say, like, good, get this guy out of here.
So, did you know right off the bat that you were thinking about going Navy, or did you look at all the branches?
No, no, the Navy was the most appealing, I think, because of where the bases were and the
Right.
travel that my previous friends who have joined have told me about. The West Packs and you know, you know, being stationed in the Air Force or the Army, you know, you're in the middle of nowhere,
Yeah.
nowhere,
Yeah.
and at least the Navy and the Marines even got some nice bases. They're all around the water.
That's
That
it.
was that was how I grew up, and that's kind of how I wanted to go.
I did a recruiting tour once upon a time, and I went and did a thing with the Army recruiter where we both went together to the class. She invited me to go, and she does this thing where she's like, has a pen, and she's like, "This is you in the Navy," and throws the pen in the middle of the carpet. She's like, "That's the ocean. Any questions?" And I was like, "Oh, okay, that's what we're doing. Cool." I got the pen. I was like, "This is you in the Army." That's Missouri, bro. Like, and I told him, I said, not for nothing. Anywhere we go, we're on the beach, baby. Like everywhere we go.
Yeah.
And I was recruiting in Central Florida, so of course the beach appealed to the kids, right? They liked that idea, so I can relate to that 100%. When you went to the service, did you know what you wanted to do for work? Like, did you have any idea what you were interested in doing?
Well, it was going to be something. I was okay with engines and stuff like that, but when I went and tested, I think the Navy does a pretty good job at pigeonholing people into things they like to do, right?
Right.
And at first they got me as CT, OS, QM, that type of stuff, right? So
Yeah.
long story short, I'm an OS, was an OS, and loved every minute of it actually.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
So you came in as an OS, like you went to A
Yes.
school and all that stuff.
Yep. Went to A school. And at the time the A school was in Virginia. So, I went to boot camp in Orlando. Spent some time there, obviously, then got shipped up to Virginia Beach, which is also, not a bad place to be.
Yeah.
So I was like, yeah, this is pretty cool.
Yeah. So how was that going from? Well, first of all, boot camp, right? Did that meet your expectations? Was it what you thought it was going to be?
It is easy.
Yeah.
No lie, it was easy. All you just needed is a little bit of discipline
Yeah.
and be able to march and being able to exercise. And that was, I was young, so I was
Yeah.
no issues there.
No, no, it's like two kinds of people so far that as I talk, have these conversations, and throughout my career, when I would speak with people, it's either people that really had like, oh my god, this moment of like, holy cow, I'm in the military, or like it wasn't overly complicated. Just
No,
get through it.
it was pretty easy.
Yeah. So Virginia Beach, going up there for A school, how was that being essentially, a young man in the service, got buddies going to school with you? Was that a good time? Did you really enjoy getting out in the town?
Oh, that was a fantastic time actually.
Yeah,
Um, Met a lot of people there, and actually, went, at the time, they were sending 5 or 6 OSs to each ship, so I went there with a few folks I went to school with, went to A school with, and kind of held friendships with them. Went to A school with Mike Magneta. I don't know
hmm,
if you know who Mike is.
I do.
Yeah, Mike. He's up in the Great Lakes area now.
Yep.
But he went. Oh, we were OS A school mates.
No,
Along with
no.
a bunch of other folks that held relationships with pretty much for a long time.
I look at those kinds of schools you go to when you're a young sailor, before you have family, before you have all these extra things, and you really have make some good friends, go have some good evenings, some good times, because everyone's got a little bit of money, everyone's got
Yeah.
the same schedule to be back in time for a class or whatever, and you just make those. How long was A school?
I want to say that we were there 14, 16 weeks, and
Wow.
we were in night class. So we were a bunch of hooligans,
I bet.
We we had to show up at class. I think if I'm not mistaken, class was like, started at 3 or 2 or for something in the neighborhood, and would end like about 11-ish. There were,
Yeah.
and we we were doing so well that we would actually get let out early, like on a Friday night, or especially Friday nights, we'd be
Yeah.
out of there like at 8,
Yeah.
you know, and the instructor always told us, as long as you guys keep your averages above 90, you guys, I got no problems with what you guys do.
Yeah. Hey, I did a tour as an instructor too. I get that. As a Navy instructor, as long as the students are getting passing the test and doing what they need to do, Fridays can always be made a little bit earlier a day to get out of town.
And the Navy was different back then, Virginia Beach, they had their clubs there even on base,
Yeah.
and they had one of those clubs that, you know, you'd have to have a bunch of ones with you, on base. So this dates a lot of people who probably come in the Navy, and the Navy was a lot different back then, you
So
know.
what year did you actually join the service?
1987.
1987. Yes, sir. I'm not gonna tell you how old I was in 1987. So
That's okay.
he
That's
said
okay.
it's okay, used to it. No, that's so. Oh my god, I can only imagine joining the Navy in the late '80s, man. Like that's gotta be a crazy time to come into the
Mm.
service. I mean, the country was a great place to be in the '80s,
The
right?
Navy was a really good place, actually.
Uh, yeah. So after A school, did you stay in Virginia Beach, or where'd you go to next?
No, my first ship was out of Pearl Harbor. Um, so yeah, being back then, I don't know if they still do it now, but back then, you picked your orders depending on how where you stood in the class.
Yeah,
There was about 100 of us there, and I'm pretty sure I picked in the top 10. Um, they were all upset because most of our class, the night class, right,
right.
had all the top spots, and we all went to Hawaii, San Diego,
Yeah.
and left Norfolk to all the guys that didn't finish so good.
Hey, Pearl Harbor has always been a top choice for people to pick for orders. It's definitely someone to want to try to get out there to and hopefully enjoy that just the weather, the scenery, the people, the climate, all the above. Uh, what kind of a ship was it?
It was a Knox class frigate.
So what's the difference between a Knox class frigate and the other kinds of frigates? Is there a difference in like propulsion plant? Was there a difference in like mission set, or was it just
Oh
a
yeah,
similar?
well, it was, the frigates back then were were ASW platforms mostly. But
Okay,
it was an old school ship, and other than like it didn't have any gas turbines, and
right.
had boilers, and old school, you
So
know.
is a steamship.
Absolutely.
That's what I was interested in. So for me, that's an interesting culture, right? Because I've never seen that. I've only seen gas turbine frigates, right? I've only seen. I also knew there was a variant of nuclear ship. They were like cruisers back in the day,
Yeah.
right? But for you to be on a steamship on a frigate, that had to be an interesting time. Major steam leaks, major fuel oil leaks, training for all those same kinds of casualties, probably, but a crew size that's much smaller than what we're used to in today's Navy for a steam platform. Um, how was that when you first got to the ship? Was it? Do you remember when you first got there? How that
Oh,
whole thing took place?
oh, absolutely. I remember to a T my first night, on board that ship. The first night, you get there, and I want to say I got to the ship probably about 8 o'clock or something. There, it was dark already, and you know, some third class come and got me and said, "Hey, I'm show you to our berthing area." And he goes, and then you're gonna change because I showed up in uniform, right? And then we're gonna
Right.
go out. So we went to this, we walked the ship to go to berthing a certain way,
Yeah.
right? And not the shortest way. And
Right.
I took that way for a good month, when I got back to the ship. It's kind
Yeah.
of funny, but I packed my stuff. He goes, "Here's your rack." Threw my lock on it. He goes, "Good, we're going out." Change, boom, boom, hit the town that night. We're out in town. We didn't stay out too late, but
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really cool. And it was a good Liberty buddy, right? He wasn't somebody that did
Oh
you
yeah,
wrong.
yeah. He just said, "Hey, we're meeting up with all the guys." So we're meeting up with the good chunk of shipmates at the time. Not all OSs, but just a bunch of guys.
How was that traveling overseas in the late 80s? Because I went to Bellawood, my first ship, late 90s, over to Sasebo, and I remember having no communication with the ship. There wasn't email, there wasn't any of those things at that point. I can only imagine in the late 80s it even being worse because there was just nothing. I remember landing on the airport and trying to figure out where do the Americans go because I'm in Japan and what's going on. Now, Pearl Harbor, of course, is a little different, but still, that's a long flight. Did you go home on leave first, or did you go
I
right from
did.
Ho Chi
I
Minh?
did. Yeah, I did. I want to say, just under a month, probably. I forget how many days I did, but I did.
Okay, and then you went to Pearl Harbor. Uh, was it pretty easy to get from the airport to the ship?
Yeah, it wasn't too bad. They had a van that was there that kind of picked everybody up that was coming in. It wasn't necessarily the ship's van. I think it was a duty van of some sort that
Right,
that dropped off a bunch of sailors at different ships.
right. That's I mean that's the best way to do it. Just being honest. A great sponsorship program. Got it. They're gonna be there to meet their person, like in Guam, right? Everyone's at the airport meeting their
Yeah,
person. Um, but ultimately, a fleet concentration area like that, having a van that's available just go get people to and from the base would be huge. And I would tell you that was something that we tried to look into getting as an installation when I was at Naval Base Guam. And you would have thought we were asking for the world, right? You would have thought we were asking for so much, and ultimately the afloat commands figured out how to do it themselves with their shore-based squadron, the submarine force. Um, but I'm glad to hear that that was something like that for you back then to get you to the ship. When you were on that ferry, what was that ship? USS
Rathburn.
Radford. So when you're on the USS Radford, how long did you do for that first ship? Was that a 3-year tour or five?
Just under 4.
Under four.
Yeah,
And
just
did you
under
guys
4.
go like on any deployments there?
Oh, definitely. We did 2 deployments at that ship, and boy, they were some nice ones. They were good ones.
I bet.
Steamed from Pearl all the way out to the Indian Ocean, and then every port in between, right?
Now,
Um,
yeah. Did you guys go as a part of a carrier strike group, or were you guys a part of a smaller group? How where did you play the same role the frigates play today with an aircraft carrier?
we did. Those first 2 deployments were part of a carrier strike group.
So how was that being an OS and the CIC, stand to watch, underway, working with the aircraft carrier? Did you really get the chance to learn your rate really good during those
Oh,
years?
it's when you make your money as an OS. And what I mean by that is, you know, you it's when you get all your qualifications. It's when you get all the great billets and bullets, and all the stuff that you accomplished and all the stuff you do. That's kind of how you make chief, right? You you got to be on a great thing, and it's got to be underway on deployment. You
Right.
know, and as an OS, if you're not doing that, then you're waiting to make chief.
Yeah. I mean, and as an for sure, OS has got to be out there operational. And there's different flavors of OS, I feel like. I'm a Gator guy. And so you had the OSs that understood like amphibious operations really, really well. Or you had the OSs that learned like Aztec and they're out there figuring out how to do like aviation warfare and to support the TAO and to support all those people in the CIC space that are in those special warfare genres of Navy leadership. When you're there on the frigate, what's their primary role? Are they primarily there? Are they worried about air operations? Or are they primarily worried about like the shotgun role and just what do they do for the operational team?
Yeah, we definitely did our time in shotgun. We had 2 embarked helicopters, old school SH-2 Foxtrots. I actually was a controller. Um, I started doing that as a third class. So I got to control aircraft both those deployments. You
Yeah,
know, playing guard, shotgun. Not a whole lot of shotgun, but a lot of playing guard. You know,
very cool. I don't think people understand how much that they do on the small boys to support the big deck. That's the equivalent of what's happened on the big deck, but with a much smaller staff, right? So there you are as a third
yeah,
class controlling aircraft, right? Controlling controlling the deck, if you will, right?
Yeah.
Good stuff. So 2 deployments. When you look back on that first ship, those first Liberty ports, I mean, that had to have been some of the best Westpacks you've ever done throughout your career. I mean,
Yeah, I'm just lucky I'm alive, I think. Uh, you know, it's different Navy, Gary, different Navy.
it's a different world, man. But yeah, for sure. Just agreed. You going out there and who knows where anyone's at, right? I mean, I've been
Yeah.
alone and unafraid in Bali before and thinking, how the hell did I get out in this spot? I'm not supposed to be here. I'm running. Like I gotta go. This is not safe to be in.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So when you get ready to leave that ship, do you think you're staying in the Navy at that point? When did you decide you're staying in?
Well, I was getting out actually, and I was want to say I was probably about a month or so out, maybe 2 months out, and we were, I just gotten married, so we were just kind of figuring stuff out, and my chief was just on me all the time. You got to stay, you got to stay. I'm like, he goes, what do you want to do? I said, well, I want to go to school. I want to finish my school. I want to go to shore duty. I want to chill a little bit. He says, well, if I could get you over to ATG, you take the orders. I said, well, what do you mean? He goes, no, I need a commitment from you. He goes, if I stick my neck out for you, because at the time I wasn't ESWAS qualified, they
Mhm.
weren't taking any ESWAS, non-ESWAS guys, right, at ATG at the time. And he says, if I stick my neck out for you, and he had already got me orders, but he just wanted, I think he wanted me to commit to him or to say yeah. So I said, yeah, I'll take it. He goes, you promise? I said, have I ever not like done what I'm supposed to do? He
Yeah.
goes, all right. So then, day goes by and he says, I got you orders. You're going to ATG. At the time, it was FTG, right? It
Right.
wasn't ATG. It was FTG, Fleet Training Group. So that was my shore duty. Heading over there.
Were you an
In which
OS2 at the time?
OS2, yeah.
OS2, and you say you met your wife while you were on your first ship. Is your wife from Hawaii originally?
But she was going to school out there.
Okay, awesome. So that was a chance for you to get connection. Now you got a family thing going on, going to ATG as an OS2. What's an OS2 doing at FTG, Fleet Training
Well, I
Group?
was we were doing like radio talker school. I was doing OS intermediate school, OS watch supervisor, um, rules of the road, uh, bunch of OS, CIC type of stuff.
Okay,
Classroom
so
classroom teaching.
that's good. I mean, that's actually a really good place for you to go to. It sounds like
Yeah, as
some
a second
downtime.
class, I was only second class there at the time. Bunch of first classes and chiefs that were there. So,
And
I
were
was a
you
young
still in
guy.
Pearl Harbor?
Yeah, Pearl Harbor.
Nice. So that's not a bad deal. 4 years on the ship. You do 3 full years at FTG.
Yeah, 3 years.
Okay. Now at the end of that tour, did you decide, okay, I'm staying Navy at that point?
Oh yeah, once I was there, I'm 8 years in, right, close to 8 years, right, and yeah, so from there I went to a Spruance class destroyer,
Yeah.
out of Pearl Harbor.
Okay. So,
So
well, I think why that matters is you said the 8 year mark. Whenever I would talk to people about they're making their life choices about staying in or getting out, and that 7, 8 year mark would come up because typically they're ending their first short tour. And I would be like, look, you're about halfway done with an investment that could return something to you for the rest of your life. But I've seen people walk away at that 7 year mark, the 8 year mark, just but they'll finish at their school or whatever it is. So a lot of people have that question in their mind, like, what am I gonna do or where am I gonna stay in or not? Um, you got the chance to do another ship in Hawaii. Was that hard to get another ship in Hawaii at that point in time, or was it easy?
I think it was easy, and
Okay.
truth be told, Gary, I've done 4 ships out of Hawaii,
Oh,
um,
cool.
and basically I didn't leave Hawaii till 2014.
That's awesome, man. I
Yeah.
think that it's great if somebody can home port like hub down. I used to go back to the States when I'd come from Japan, and like get into arguments. Like when I sat the board one time, we were having this conversation about people that wanted to be consecutive overseas tours. And I was
Mhm.
like, look, man, y'all want to stay in San Diego for 14, 15 years? I don't care. Like, enjoy it, bro. Why are you going to get mad if this person wants to be in Sasebo for that many years? They may have a spouse over there, they may have a life. And because, there's a period in time where our Navy was forcing people to come back from overseas duty, and everyone thinks it's just about the money, but the money's not that good.
Yeah.
It's the lifestyle, it's the culture, it's the location, it's all the above, right? You make a home there. So I'm happy that was able to work out for you. As long as it worked for you, that's awesome, man.
No, it did, and I had those same conversations at selection boards myself, you know,
Yeah,
and telling them, I did it, it's all about the billet and your job,
yeah,
and as long as you're not, I think the best thing that happened is when um, they moved ATG to a straight shore duty billet. And remember, it used to be like a neutral at sea, and some
yep,
guys were like going back to backs and doing stupid stuff like that. And I say stupid because it just hurt their career. You got to
yeah.
be on a great thing. You got to be on a warship. That's how you make your money in the Navy. In our facet of the Navy, right? We're
Yep,
service warriors, right? So,
yep.
I mean, there's we got other facets of the Navy that don't have to be on the great things, but you got to do the hard jobs.
No, no, for sure. And I don't even know why somebody would want it. I mean, I guess I could see the allure to like going back to back ATG tour because I remember when it was considered that kind of a duty station. People didn't want to go there. But the reality is, when I was a chief petty officer, senior chief, if I found out you had done back to back ATG tours, we might not have got along very good because I'm out there
No,
doing the job and you're
no,
kicking
that's
my butt.
that's yeah, that's it's something that I'm glad they stopped doing.
Yeah,
Because people, some people take the easy way out, Gary. You know that.
I do.
And
So
I'm not
did you
saying
make chief?
ATG is hard. ATG is
Yeah,
hard for a shore duty, but not for a neutral duty that you could continue to do it back and forth.
that's a fact. Well, and what I loved about my time at ATG was as soon as the brow was over, we're walking off, right? And none of the problems I had just discovered on that ship are my problem, right? I was leaving, and then when I got the opportunity to go to the USS George Washington after my ATG time, everybody was like, "What are you doing going to carrier? That's crazy. Like, that's not the Manning, whatever." I was like, "Look, I've been assessing carriers for the last 2.5 years. Who better? Like, let's go, bro. I'm gonna go out there and put it to work." And it almost killed me. It was a good
Yeah,
couple of years, right? So I
yeah,
get that. Did you make cheap on that next ship?
yeah. I did. I went, showed up as a second class and left as a chief.
Yeah, I like that. So, what year did you put on anchors?
98.
1998. So I'd been in the Navy a year at that point. Yeah. Okay. So you put on anchors at 1998. When you look back on your chief petty officer initiation process, what was your opinion of the process you went through?
Um, I thought it was good. And what I mean by that, it was pretty stressful. It was trying. Taught me a lot of stuff. There wasn't a whole lot of stupid shenanigans. And there
Mhm.
could have been, because I I found out I made chief a month before we deployed, you know, or whatever it was at the time, 2 months before we deployed. So basically, I showed up for our deployment day, as Chief Select Ortega, right?
Yeah.
And there ain't no running from nobody on a Nox on a destroyer. There's no hiding, there's no running.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was just like it was a rough 6 7 weeks before we got pinned.
How many other guys made it with you on board that ship? Do you remember?
Yeah, there was 4 of us.
That's good. That's a good number right there. Four is
Yeah,
perfect for a DDG.
yeah,
Okay. And I always ask that question because I think people have had different opinions of the initiation. I love Chiefs initiation, man. What's funny? When I got initiated, I really had no idea what was even going to happen. I was a DC one that was just trying hard to be a DC one, and I didn't know how to put a Chiefs package in. The CMC came and told me I was sport eligible. I didn't even know what that was, and I had to learn how to put the package in. And when I went through initiation, I remember I didn't even know what the Chiefs creed was at first because the first time I ever heard it, I was half asleep on the flight deck coming off of the whole nighter, But I will tell you, when I went to my next Chiefs mess as a chief petty officer and I got that next year of seasoning and experience, oh man, it really cemented everything for me. And I was able to leverage that experience from when I made chief in '06 all the way till I retired in 2022. And every year I think I made really strong chiefs. I
Yeah,
don't look back any of my initiations where I feel like we left anybody behind. Right.
yeah,
I
and
think we
I
always did
used
a
to,
pretty good job.
yeah, I used to always let the newer chiefs, right, the ones that just got through, the year before, right, say, hey, this is where you kind of make your money a little bit because everything is just going to fall into place. I mean, a
Yep.
lot of confusion when you go through, you're just trying to make it, to that day, and then everything's a blur, right? Everything's a blur, and it's that second year, that you go, whoa, this is some really good stuff.
Yeah. Well, and I think surface Navy in particular we're different than the other areas of our Navy because I got the blessing to be around aviation. I got the blessing to be around like expeditionary forces or submariners. But I'll tell you, there's something special about being on a surface ship in a Chiefs mess. It's just a unique place to be. I've done an aircraft carrier, right? And that was a lot, right? That was a lot of people.
Sure.
But being on a ship with 4 selectees, 30 something Chiefs, that's a great place to be to really get the picture of what you're trying to get done, for sure. So after that ship, you put on chief. Where do you go to next?
I went to staff duty at Mid-Pac, Common Master for
Okay,
Mid-Pac, and did that for two
awesome.
years.
Two
I,
years.
yeah, I left there early to get another ship. So this took some negotiating, and talking to my detailer,
Yeah,
right? Because it was like, hey, I wouldn't mind sticking around Hawaii, and the detailer was like, yeah, well, that ain't gonna happen. You're
right,
going here, you're going there. I said, all
right.
right. I said, all right. I got selected for the SEA at the time, and I said, I'm going to go to the SEA at this mark, and it's at the 2 year mark, right? I said, I'll take a ship out of Hawaii. I know you got one, a hard fill, a couple of them, and he called me back the next day and gave me the orders.
Hey, well, so terminating that short duty early, going to how was the SCA? You went there as the chief petty officer?
Senior chief. I was senior chief. I made senior chief soon after leaving the the destroyer.
Wow. So you put on chief on the destroyer. So you got second class to chief, and then you made senior chief after that destroyer as well.
Yeah.
What was it about that tour that was such a strong tour for you that you went all that way, even to the senior chief? Like, what were you doing on that tour that really was just the things that you needed to do?
Well, I think there was a lot of stuff going on back then, in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf.
Yeah,
As a first class, I did a lot of things that chiefs and officers were doing, you know, escorting boats. I've escorted a few of those dhows up and down, the motorway at night from midnight to 6 in the morning, from, the Northern Arabian Gulf all the way to UAE,
right,
and, as a chief, it's kind of putting, tomahawks on target, during that
right.
deployment. So that was actually pretty good OS deployment as far as putting good stuff for our age, our Tomahawk FCs too at the time. But
Yeah.
yeah, so I mean, deployments.
Okay, good to go. I think that's amazing. So you made senior chief in how many years?
I want to say 13-ish.
13-ish. And so you
13.
get the SEA as a senior chief. When you went to did you already know before you went to the SEA that you were going to consider the command master chief route?
No,
Okay.
no. I
So
mean, I got there and there was a lot of there's there was a lot of fleets and forces that were in my class, right? So they were senior chief's getting ready to make master chief, basically,
Right.
right? Where I was a senior chief, needed to put my time in, right? So I was still not ready, I was still, thinking I was probably a master chief, but in reality, I need to put some time in. I need to get one, I need to get, a few more deployments, doing that type of level stuff.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but you know, I mean, I thought the guys were cool, and I thought they're doing what they're doing. But you know, I, I, I think I did know, looking back at it, just maybe a little bit that, making chief and watching the CMC on that, on that in the destroyer, right, is like shit. I want to do his job, you know.
Yeah.
I wanted to his. He used to, we used to laugh a lot, right? Because I used to say, man, CMC, you're like the third person to charge this ship. There's the
Right.
Theo, the XO, and it's you. He looked at me and say, he say, you're dumb, man.
Yeah. When you went to SCA, was it that it was the in person? Like you were up there for like 11 weeks, right?
Oh yeah, it was in the old building. It was in the Talmadge building, and we were housed and went to school and class in the same building. There was no extra buildings or none of the new stuff they got now.
Yeah. How did you like that being up there for that long? Do you think it was too long?
No, I thought it was good.
Thought it was good.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, it was awesome.
I never got that experience, man. I got to go to SCA finally. I wanted to go as a senior chief. Nope. Master chief. Nope. It wasn't until I put in a dang CMC package, you got
They
selected
made
that
you
I
go,
finally got to
right?
go to SCA. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think by then it was the 3-week course with the virtual thing. And I'm like, look, man, I don't mind. I mean, all my education was virtual. So I don't mind virtual, but I kind of wanted that 11-week experience you know, I had never been to, I'd only been to one actual real military ball, but I'm an engineer. I'm not going to no balls over on base. Like I'm what? I took my wife to a Gator ball one time and that was it. So I was really nervous going into the CMC program about how I'm having to go to a military ball, like a Navy ball. I was nervous. I wanted to learn how to do that at
yeah,
SCA, and we didn't do it. They got rid of
yeah,
it.
yeah. That
Yeah,
was
I was
that
kind of
was that
disappointed
was
about
that
that.
was a good event for us in that during that time.
Yeah. So after SCA, you go to that next ship. Now you're going there as a senior chief.
Yep.
Um, it's another DDG,
No, it was a Aegis cruiser.
a cruiser. Got it. So Aegis cruiser. And do you remember that, like in that mess, how many senior chiefs were there on that ship? Was there only 2 or 3 of you?
Um, no, we had a senior chief in every department.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. No, it was 2002. So yeah, department chiefs were senior chiefs. There we had and then we actually had three master chiefs too. We had the CMC, we had the 3MC, and then we had the Aegis master chief. So
Wow.
uh, we were and then there was a senior chief, and then in every department, supply, you know engineering obviously had top snipe. He was a senior chief. um and
That's
it was
pretty
good though.
good. That's pretty good manning, man. So, did you always have you had always had really good up to that point? Had you always had pretty healthy Chiefs messes?
So yeah, no doubt.
Good.
um Probably, I don't know, I've been fortunate, to be in some really awesome messes, even as a CMC,
Yeah.
the mess is just different. The different role you play in leadership as a chief and as a senior chief, department chief, at the time, um, going into went to the USS Port Royal. After 2 years of being about a year and a half being there, I was a senior listed watch bill coordinator, right? So
Mm,
I was running the watch bills,
yeah.
um, for the ship, and then I was a senior dog, right? So it was kind of, I considered it my mess, right? The CMC would look to me to get shit done, you know, and as a CMC on board a ship, you've got to have your little alliances, right? And you got to know which guy to to kind of, or gal, to kind of go and say, hey, we need to do this, and you're
Yep.
going to lead this effort for me, and I'm going to talk about it today at the mess meeting, and be ready to talk, and you're it. You got my full back end, and we're gonna get this done.
Yeah.
Whether it was sometimes CEO would say, hey, we got to get this, we got to do this and this, and you just look and say, how the heck are we going to do this? There's no way that we possibly could complete this, right? And you sit in your office and put your hands in your head, and you sit there for a while, and you know do whatever you got to do, come up with a plan, and then you got to get the mess behind you, man. And you got to just freaking
That's it.
do stuff that that they didn't think they could do, right? Because every time you used to say it, right? I don't know if you got a PG show here or not, but serving that shit sandwich, right, to the mess sometimes, isn't popular,
Yeah.
you know. And I had to serve that a lot,
Yeah.
a lot.
Well, and hopefully a good mess. They understand that it's a sandwich that nobody wants to eat, right? We all smell it. We all know it's shit. No one's trying to overwhelmingly not have it there. It's just it is what it is. Even the captain knows it. It's the mission, right? And sometimes
Yeah,
the fastest way to do it is get it done. And to your point, I'll tell you, my time as a senior chief, that was a tough time, right? The years is senior chief's a tough pay grade I found throughout my career. It's just, you've been a chief longer than the chiefs, but you're not quite a mass chief yet, and it's just this weird space. And it's very special when you can find people that had the good experience during that time. And I used to say, I expect my senior chiefs to chief the chiefs. I expect my chiefs not to need it, and I expect my master chiefs to coordinate the whole damn thing, and no one knows they're doing it, right? And
yeah,
and that was the way I leveraged my mess. And my senior chiefs were always put in leadership roles because I wanted them to get that experience. Because when I was a senior chief, that's where I wanted to be. I wanted to be that lead dog, like you said, like running and showing that I was not even because I cared to make master chief. I was so happy to be a chief. I just was proud to be a senior chief.
yeah. No, I,
you
I
know?
I enjoyed that role. I enjoyed being a hammer, and it took me a little bit, and it took, because I was in Hawaii for such a long time, it took a little bit to kind of, for people to see me a little differently, right? Because
Mm,
our senior chief Ortega, that dude right there, he's a hammer, man.
yeah.
You know, it's like,
Well,
oh, he's
yeah.
coming to be our master chief, or he's coming to be our CMC, and they're like, oh my god, and then
Yeah.
what the heck happened to you, man? I heard you were like the hammer.
Yeah. No, I had
It's
the
like
same
it's like,
thing.
man, every position demands a different style of leadership, and if you don't learn that, and I said, you're gonna get nowhere, because you're gonna spin your wheels on how to get something done.
Yeah. No, I had the exact same reputation on the waterfront and in my community. And I would rather have that reputation though over the guy who was known for like gun decking or the guy who was known for taking, I'd rather be the hammer. And then they find out you're nicer than they thought you were gonna be,
Yeah.
vice vice something else. So all right, so you leave that cruiser. Do you pick up nine there?
Short, yeah, short, really quickly after that. Really quickly after
Okay.
that. So I left the Port Royal, and then went over again to ATG, Midpack to Hawaii.
Okay.
And I, you know, quickly put in a CMC package, um, waited for the board, and then after that, waited for billeting, right? So it was kind of a stopover for me, kind of, get a little decompress a little bit, but let the administrative part, kind of work its way out. But one thing that I'm proud of, doing Port Royal stuff, not just our deployments, but um, man, when I was a senior chief there, I want to say I made at least close to 20 khakis out of OSs. You
Wow.
know, yeah, some, couple master chiefs, some went LDO route after chief, um, and retired as lieutenant commanders and lieutenants, and
Very
warrant
cool.
warrant fours, and very few. The ones that didn't make chief were the ones that got out, which was
Right.
only a few. Yeah, but
So that's
there's
awesome, man.
yeah, there's still a couple master chiefs running around that's got my little stamp on their butt, probably.
So you said you put your package in right after picking up Master Chief.
Yeah.
So did you already know that if you made 9 that you wanted to apply for the CMC program then?
Yeah, at that time, because the billet structure for OS at that time wasn't something I wanted to continue. It was, shore duty and then a carrier, right? And not that
Yep.
I don't want to be at a carrier, it would have been an administrative type of role. And I
Yep.
mean, you've been on a carrier, you kind of know what the master chiefs kind of do there, which is important as heck, right? But I
Yeah.
wanted to do it at a level, I wanted to do it on a Des cruise ship as a CMC vice, big deck, that type of stuff.
So when you applied for the program, did you get picked up first time?
Yeah.
Nice. So what year did you get selected for the CMC program?
I want to say 2008, 7, something like that.
Okay, got it. And where'd you go for your first ship?
USS Lake Erie.
Was that Hawaii as well?
Yeah, that was a cruise out of Hawaii.
Lake Erie. Okay. So 2007, 2008, you go there as a CMC. How different did you approach that sea tour versus your previous tours?
Oh, it was completely different, because um, I mean, always, I always go in and kind of listen and kind of, uh, look around a little bit, right? Um, and up to that point, as a senior chief, I kind of knew what I wanted to do, I guess. And then a master chief is just kind of like, oh, I got to figure this stuff out, right? I'm the CMC now, so now I got to, get into the programs and making sure that those things are run correctly and run right, and
Yeah.
put my spin on it a little bit and kind of go forward with that. But yeah, I almost didn't make it. Actually, I almost freaking probably got fired the first couple of weeks I was there.
Why do you say that?
Oh, because me and the XO didn't get along at all.
Uh, brother, I've heard that so many times though, just being honest. I've been there. What was the problem?
Him.
Okay. Was just because he had already been there before you got there.
Yeah, it was just stuff I really don't want to get into, other than
Okay.
there was things going on that shouldn't have been going on.
Well, and I tell you that. So I got to my first ship as a CMC, and we had serious problems. We had big culture problems. We had just big problems. And I remember I was concerned that when I was going to do the right thing, but my CO had been the XO before he was a CO, and this was not we're all great friends now, but trust you me, when I was bringing up my perspectives, my ideas, they weren't always well received. When I had to lower the ESWAS pennant of the ship because we didn't deserve to fly it, and it was just, and so I can understand where as a young CMC going into that kind of a space and time, it can be scary as hell. And like you said, you felt like you might get fired your first 2, 3 weeks on the job, right? And
Yeah,
it has nothing to do with how good of an OS you are, right? It
yeah,
has it's just now it's about personal relationships or perspectives or whatever. And yeah, no, I can relate, bro, 100%.
yeah.
Um,
Luckily, he was retiring very, very, very soon after after me showing up. So the CO just said, "Hey, just I can't tell you what to do, but just take, this is gonna be different here in 2 weeks." You
so
know.
the CO had visibility there was a
Oh,
problem though,
absolutely, absolutely.
and he wasn't surprised.
No.
Okay, then the CO was letting him get away with being an ass, probably, it sounds like.
I don't know. I don't want to say there's a lot of responsibility,
Yeah,
and you got to divvy it up. And I don't put blame on anybody. It's just a lot of there was a lot of responsibility, and he was at the time probably trying to fill a lot of different spaces, right? Different
yeah.
lanes, and he was doing what he thought he was supposed to be doing,
How
and it
okay.
just yeah, it just wasn't right.
I appreciate you giving him that grace, bro.
Yeah.
How was your TMC turnover? Do you feel like did you do a turnover?
Yes, he did.
Okay. So during that turnover process, did you get any insights that there might be some challenges coming up, or did the
No,
old
I
CMC?
knew I knew before even showing up.
Okay, got it. That's
Yeah,
crazy. All right.
yeah.
Well, so when you look back on that first CMC tour after it was all said and done, what were the biggest things that caught you off guard during your first couple of years as a CMC?
I would say just the level of in a good way, the level of commitment, attitude, and work that people were putting in, you know, because I was seeing it all now, right? I mean, as a department chief, you see your piece of the pie,
Yeah.
your what you're contributed to, but as a CMC, you're seeing it all, right?
Yep.
You're hearing it all, you're doing it all. I used to spend every meal in the mess, you know, and whether it was sitting there with coffee or water because I wanted to make sure I was touching base with everybody who was coming through because underway, you're not seeing everybody, right when the meal starts. Someone could pop in an hour later and eat the meal because he was on watch or whatever. I just wanted to give everyone the opportunity to reach out to me or for me to kind of get the pulse of everybody, as we kind of went through. So a lot of times people would say, God, CMC, you're always in a damn mess. I said, no, I'm in the mess during meal time so I could, talk to the past, be available for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's a great perspective, and I will tell you, for me, I went from being an engineer, where there's two kinds of people on a ship, engineers and writers. So I go from being an engineer to being a person who's working to thread together a team that cares about the whole ship and trying to convince everyone. Because again, as a damage control man, I was for everybody. I was blessed with that opportunity because DCs and all hands effort and all that stuff. And so ER9 and all those things, I got the chance to know everybody. But then as a CMC, I had to always convince everyone, like, look, supply needs everyone's support right now. We all got to help supply. Or deck has a big event coming up. We all got to support deck. And making those things, those conversations happen during the mess meetings, just so everyone could hear that everyone cares about each other's assessments, each other's trials, tribulations, whatever it is. And what I love about being down there during chow time, because I was the same way. I love being down there during chow time because that was when you got to see most everyone together underway
Yeah.
because of the different rotations. Some guys are 6 and 6, some guys are 12 on, 12 off, some guys, whatever. Some guys have no hours, they just round the clock. They just, they just, I mean, when I was a senior chief, I didn't have, I stood watch, sure, but I also worked all the damn time. It's just how it was. So,
But when I did my CMC tour, though, I was really fortunate, man. I had some really good chiefs, and I had some really hammer department chiefs. A few master chiefs that were, that and then a few other chiefs, and I kind of stacked the deck a little bit, knowing I
mhm.
was going to going to the Lake Erie and knowing what the billet structure was, and I reached out to a couple guys to make sure they were maybe coming my way. Um, but also when you talked about like, hey, we got to help this department or this department's going through this, right? I'd stack the deck too, and I'd go find the hammer chief and say, who's not a part of that department, and say, hey, you know, I'm getting ready to put this, and we're going to put this down, deck's going through this, or, supplies going through this, or engineers going through this. I said, I need you to come out in the mass and say, you know, I got it. I'm running it. I'm running this program and this is what I need, you know,
Yeah,
and, and, once you do that, it becomes, everyone just gets on board,
yeah,
and it's just, I don't know. I felt like I don't want to feel like I was cheating the system a little bit, but I was playing chess a little bit sometimes, and in those mess meetings or whatever you want to call it, getting everyone together and getting us in one direction and moving because you have to, and we had to do it quick.
yeah. No, no, but that's exactly what active communication means, though, right? Active communication up and down the chain of command, and strategic communication and messaging, and 100%. And I think leveraging those relationships and knowing your talent, knowing if I go talk to this guy about this opportunity, he he's a red meat eater. He's
Oh
gonna want
yeah,
it. He's gonna run with it, and other people are gonna want to help him because most everybody wants to help. Not everybody wants to carry the responsibility, right? So give the responsibility to the one that wants it, but then let other people help them be successful. And you know what? We all win if we don't care who gets the credit. And that's the CMC's ultimate job, in my opinion, is to make sure that the fairness is distributed across the board. Everyone's getting a fair opportunity as long as they put their work in, right? As long as they put their work in and trust the process. Those are all real things. Uh, so you leaving that ship, how many years do you have in the Navy at the end of that tour?
I started this my CMC tour at 20.
Okay, so
At
you had
20.
CMC at 20, so
Yeah.
23. Where do you go after that ship?
I went to Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam as a CMC on base.
Oh, the base mass chief.
Yeah.
Nice. I mean, you're perfect for the job, though. I mean, think about it. You've been around there a long time. When did you get there?
Uh, 2011-ish, 12.
11, 12. Okay, I was on GW then. Got it. Trying to think. Because that sounds familiar too, you being Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam. How did you like your base tour?
Oh, it was awesome. It was a good tour for me. We did a couple rim packs, only because of it was an off year, so we were able to do that. It's I don't want to say it was a political tour, but there are a lot of people coming into Pearl Harbor, you know,
Yeah,
and coming to see me or coming to see the boss, right? And as the base CMC, I did a lot of stuff, you know, and we were fighting through different things, different funding issues, and learning, the CNIC kind of kind of thing, and I think what people fail to realize, I think in some positions, is that you're not going to get anything done other than starting something, right?
yeah,
But you gotta get to that point, and you got to get to the point where you're handing it off or you're finishing it, because and then the fruition comes years after funding comes in, right? And that
yeah,
being a base guy, right? you know
yeah.
you're catching up and you're just plugging holes, right? And you say, hey, we need a new barracks, we need to do this, I need a new program here, and then you go see the right people and you start it. You start the process, doing all that legwork and all the paperwork to get it done, um, which unfortunately I don't have the patience for.
Yeah,
Being a Navy guy, I am, right?
yeah,
But you got to start those programs, man. Hey, we got to redo these barracks. Hey, we got to do this. Hey, housing's got to start doing this now. A lot of stuff, right? You know,
yeah. It's a lot of paperwork. I remember when I got to the base job and just thinking to myself, like, number one, I had like no military, it felt like, because at least in Guam, all I had was the security forces and like the
yeah.
dive blocker.
Hey,
That
hey,
was
two
it.
great places, dude. Two great places.
Yeah,
You know what? I used to always go to the kennels, man. You go to the kennels, go to dive locker.
yeah,
Those are two special places in Guam, but there are also special places in other places too, right? I mean, because
yeah, for sure.
Hawaii had a dive locker, obviously, and we had a pretty big security force, which was a joint security force, which was kind of cool. Because we had my boss made it made it his mission to make sure that Navy guys were on Air Force gates and Air Force guys were on Air Force and Navy gates, you know, and that and learning what they do, the defenders, right, the Air Force MAs,
Yeah.
right, doing what they do is kind of special too. So it was, to me, it was really good to be that part of the law enforcement and things like that, as far as CNIC goes.
How was it when you ran your Chiefs initiations on the base? Were you in charge of those joint events, or was there a different structure for that?
No, that was my program. Um, and it always has been, in the history of Pearl there, and the region master chief obviously owns it, right? Because
Yeah,
he's there. But he always let the base guy. I mean, that's your job, right? You just do it and execute it. And in my opinion, we had some really fantastic, you know,
yeah,
processes there in Pearl where, you know, I learned early on, if you invite people to come out, they will come. And So we used to have MCPON Hurt come out all the time. At the time, MCPON West was there, right? And then people were always coming in and out of Hawaii. So you know, I just invite them. Hey, we're doing this, this, and this. Are you available to come out our final night? Come check us out. Master Chief Hurt was so awesome with that.
Yeah.
Where he would come out. I think he came out every year I was there. Um, and then when I was at Mid-Pac, you know, I wasn't in charge of the process, but I was a master chief in our mess, right? In the Hawaii mess. So, we reached out. I had a really good master chief back then. His name was Matt Welsh. I don't know if you know him or not.
Mhm.
But he's a quartermaster by trade, and he was a 3MC the last, 10 years or so of his Navy career. He he would always say, Brian, come on, let's go. We're gonna start this legacy academy up at the USS Missouri. I said,
Yeah.
yeah. He goes, yeah, we're doing it. So, he obviously was the dude in charge, but I I was you know, the young, the young senior chief getting ready to put master chief on, right? Who was doing a lot of
Yeah.
his work. But
Yeah.
yeah, he started that, that the Legacy Academy there in Pearl Harbor on Missouri, and I was there for the first 2, 3 classes, which was pretty awesome.
And I
And
think
there,
it's still going to this day, right?
yeah, to this day, it's still gone.
Yep.
To this
No, no,
day,
Pearl Harbor, without a doubt, is one of the most special places, I believe, for the chief petty officer process, the initiation, the community, watching what they did to restore the Chiefs Club on the base. Just, was that you? Were you there when they were doing
oh
that?
my goodness, the headache I went through to get that thing rolling, right?
Yeah.
Because they shut it down, right? It wasn't making any money. Um, so I talked the MWR director and my boss into giving it back to us. We were gonna refurbish it on our own dime. We were gonna do this and do that, and we would open it up for events. It wasn't open every day. It wasn't, no one was working it. We were working it ourselves, but we would open it up. For certain. We opened it up for Rimpac soon after we refurbished it, and we had a big old I hosted a big old you know social there for the
Right.
Chiefs during Rimpac years. But yeah, we that was all sweat and tears, man. It's freaking. We went in there, repainted it, rehung everything. I threw my old refrigerator in there. I threw my old couches in there from my house. A lot of people,
Yeah.
some people know, but a lot of people don't know, right? Somebody donated the stereo equipment. We went and bought TVs, and I had some chief go to the local. I forget, which cable company we went to hook up TVs and put cable in there, and he was like, "I gotta put my name on it." And I said, "Don't worry about it. Just do it." You just,
No, I get it, man. I actually stood up a khaki club in Guam at the TNTs, right? I took the back area, made it to a khaki club, and it didn't last longer than me, man. As soon as I left, they changed it and shut it down. It was so disappointing because there was nowhere on Guam for us to go have a space for just, and I made it khaki club because I was trying to, include everybody, but it was the Chiefs that were the ones using it, right? When you go
yeah,
up on the walls, because I found all the memorabilia from the old Chiefs mess that was at Naval Base Guam. I found it all after they shut it down. That was in the barracks, I guess. And so I was like,
yeah.
I got all this Navy memorabilia. It needs to go on the wall somewhere, man. Like this stuff is great.
Now, when I
And
when I was there, there used to be a Chiefs mess over on the CB side.
they still
That
have that.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
I know, yeah, that they
Yeah.
would open up every once in a while.
Yeah, they still
Yeah.
have that, but that's really for the
Yeah,
deployed guys, and
yeah,
that's
that's theirs.
funded
I
by
get it. I get it.
NECP.
But
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, but yeah. All right, so when you're Joint Base Pearl Harbor, you've done a tour already as a CMC. You just did the base job, made a lot of connections. What are you hoping to do after the base job?
didn't know. I was 2 years into the job, and my boss at the time was getting relieved in about 4 months. Um, And I was like, man, I don't want to work for another guy. I mean, I for a couple months, then so one day I'm walking through our, through our building, and our building, I was on the same floor as the Comnat Surf Group Mid-Pac Master Chief at the time, which was Patty Roebuck. I don't know if you remember her,
Mm-mm.
but she was great. She was working on the Missouri a few years back. I'm not sure what she's doing now. I kind of lost track of her, but she was great. She was mentor of mine, and she's a lot of good things, right? There in Pearl Harbor, she was a CMC on one of the DDGs, and uh, did a tour, I think, at Pac Fleet somewhere, and then went over to do the surf pack job. But I was walking to give her a hard time because a good friend of mine, Bill Lipset, who was with me for on the Port Royal and the Lake Erie, uh, was her hammer now and Master Chief. So I was going to give him a hard time in their office.
Right.
I walked in, and she's talking to the Force Master Chief about trying to fill the ATG billet, I guess. At the time is Brandon Knox. Um, and Patty was like, "Hey, I got Brian Ortega over here. Brandon just walked in my office." And
Yeah.
he said, and Brandon, he goes, "All right, Brian, what are you doing? Where's your next tour at?" And I said, "I'm not sure, man. I'm thinking about possibly soon." He goes, "Well," "I got a billet for you." He goes, "100% it's yours if you want it." And I said, "Where at?" He says, "ATG, PAX / San Diego." And I said, "How come? Why is it me?" He says,
Yeah.
"Trust me." There's too many guys knocking on my door right now that want to go over and get that job. He goes, "But I need someone that's not even in the harbor." You know,
Yeah.
and I said, "How long do I have to decide?" He says, "Pretty quick. I'll give you a day."
Right.
So I went home that night, and I said, "Hey, they just kind of offered me the job to go to San Diego." And at the time, my daughter was a senior in high school. you know. So, my daughter was born and raised in Hawaii, right, as a Navy brat, right? She
Yeah.
was getting ready to graduate and go off to college, so she was going to the mainland anyways. Mm. My son was a seventh grader who would then in turn be enrolled in eighth grade, right, and then be able to kind of start. So it seemed like a perfect opportunity.
Yeah.
So I didn't even wait. I called him up that night and said, "I'll take it."
Yeah.
And then I told my boss the next day. He was like, "Huh, sounds good."
How fast was the turn? Like, how soon were you leaving?
I was leaving within 90 days.
Wow.
I didn't even see a change of command.
Yeah. You were just out of
Yeah.
there, huh?
Yeah,
And
I was it.
Brandon, he was the Force Master Chief at that time, you said?
Yeah.
Okay. How did you like ATG San Diego?
Oh, it was awesome. It was awesome.
It's a
You
big
know,
mess.
oh man, 300 plus
Yeah.
Chiefs. So evals were something else, right?
I
And
bet.
and
Yeah.
and 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 I told everyone, I said, I've always had my hand in Chiefs evals. Always. They're mine, right? And I said, shoot, 300, that's and boy, did I worked day and night on those things.
Yeah.
Day and night, you know. It was worth it, man. We made a lot of senior chiefs. We made a lot of master chiefs. You know,
Yeah.
at the
No,
time,
ATG, yeah,
at
special.
yep, at the time, Chubbs was there with me, right? He
Yep.
was a senior chief, and uh, Brian Morris was there. There was a bunch of senior chiefs there, and Steve McQueen. I don't know, Steve.
Hmm.
I think
I do.
he's in Japan. Yeah, he's in Japan. He's
Yep.
coming back now, right? We're soon, right? He's on the America, right? He's a CMC the America.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
he's coming back. Yeah. So I mean, we had tons of guys who were just aching. Oh man, talk about a mess, man. We had some serious initiations. You know,
You d- yeah.
serious.
No,
You know,
no. ATG San Diego is a big deal, man.
I
They
I
handle business.
I called Rick West up one day, right? And I was like, "Hey, Rick," I said, "has anyone locked you in yet to come to the khaki ball?" He said, "No." I said, "Good. We taking care of you." He goes, "Oh, okay." He goes, I said, "We'll take care of anything." He says, "You just, you work through me. Tell me when you want to fly, when you want to come back. When you want to do this, where we'll put you up there. I think one of the, I think it was Grand Union Hotel we were at, nice hotel, right?" He
Yeah.
says, "Stay the whole weekend and fly out whenever you want to fly out." But and and people are like, "How do you do?" He's like, "Because well, so we had a couple guys in the mess who did coins, right?"
Right.
And that's how we kind of made some extra money to be able to do some of the things we did.
No,
Um,
100%.
and
Emblematics became the hustle once they shut down everything else, right?
we hustled it, man. But
That's it.
but I tell you what, man, that there's another conversation right there. My first day walking into ATG, right? Because Brandon Knox wasn't up front 100% with me on what was going on. So, I walked into a freaking, yeah.
I, hey, yeah, I don't know that I've ever walked into a situation that I thought was good. Just being honest with you, right? Like being honest, and it
It's
didn't matter
yeah.
whether I was a DC man or a CMC. There was always bodies just lay. They weren't even buried, bro. They were just laying on the ground, and you had to pick them up and
Yeah.
figure it out.
Well, and I'll say some stuff, right? But I'm not going to go out but there's captain's masses going on. Um, you know, the Commodore there told me that they wanted to disband our Chiefs mess. Um,
Wow.
yeah, there was a bunch, and then it's like, yeah, well, that's a good conversation to have with your boss
Yeah.
is your first day here, first day in the job. It's like, what the heck? He's
Yeah.
like,
That's
yeah,
crazy.
he's like, read this stuff. So he gives me folders of stuff. So I called Brandon later on that night, and I was like, dude, what the you give me a heads up on what the hell's going on over here?
Yeah.
And he's like, well, I told you I needed somebody completely out. I need somebody
I told
completely
you.
not in San Diego. And I'm like, oh. So, I just had to go in and say, all right. So I said, look, I said, you can't do this. I said, I'm going to fix the problem. That
Yeah.
period. I said, you guys just need to give me a month or so I'm going to fix it. Trust me, it's going to be fixed, you know, and, um, and we fixed it, we fixed it. There was some great cheese over there, man.
Yeah.
Great cheese that that
There is
that
great
were,
cheese.
you know,
So just what did you I mean, what were the tweaks? Was it just alignment? Was it just communication?
it,
Was it
it, it it's just standards, it's hey, there's we're a mess, and we need to hold standards, and we need to ourselves hold standards. There's always somebody watching. If there's you know it wasn't right. There was a lot of things that probably people say the same thing about me too. Yeah, Brian was all jacked up, he did this, he
yeah,
did that, and I give credence to that. I'm not
yeah,
perfect, right? But
yeah,
wow, talk about some moments where you sit back and you gotta like, whew, this job ain't easy,
yeah. I
you
mean,
know.
everyone gets an opinion. Everyone has an opinion, but if it's to the point where a freaking '06 is like, we're about to disband your Chiefs mess or whatever, that's
Yeah,
pretty
no,
big words because typically they're not saying that kind of stuff.
no, no,
Uh,
no. There was some serious issues going on that went on, but I'll tell you what, I mean, we I think with greater responsibility, and greater, you've got to like execute stuff, right? And I've had some incredible conversations with some of our MIG ponds that just came through, right? From Rick West uh, to Geo, um, into uh, Master Chief Hurt, right? Some of the stories he tells are ridiculous, right?
yeah,
On how Chief's initiation was going to end, right? You know, and it was going to end, and he tells the story all the time, that the CNO told him, I'm going to stop chief initiation and it's never going to happen again,
Yeah.
you know? And he said, give me a chance to fix this. I'm going to fix it, you know? So, there's, I don't want to say similarities to every command. Sometimes when you walk into stuff, things go awry a little bit. You just got to get it on track, and get people back into, you know, doing what's best and doing what's best for the Navy and sailors.
Yeah. Good to go, man. So after you leave ATG, um, what were you? Because I think I remember when we met, you were talking because you weren't quite sure what the opportunities were going to be coming your way after leaving a flow training group. But I mean, you had
Yeah.
been at that point, you'd been a DDG CMC, you'd been a base CMC. Now you got the biggest Chiefs mass. I mean, that's damn near an aircraft carrier ashore of just a Chiefs mass, right? And training the whole Surface Pacific Fleet. What are you looking to do after that? Were you looking to go into the officer, check into the flag level mass? Were you looking to go back to
Yeah.
sea again?
I mean, at that time I was at 30, right? So really the only opportunity I had was to get into the flag mess, right?
Okay.
There was some jobs I interviewed for, um, and some jobs I didn't get, obviously, until I landed one, with out there in Guam, which was a good opportunity. I'm glad I took it.
Yeah.
But yeah, but I mean, at that point, I even told them, and it never, it didn't, at the time I was like, hey, I know, I get it. I said, I'll go to an aircraft carrier. If you need someone on aircraft carrier, I told him at the time, um, Nick Pond, right? And he's like, yeah, Brian, that's what, you're at 30 and those jobs are, for guys that are under 30. And we can't slow progression for everybody just because you want a job. I said, well, I mean, it's not an easy job. I said, maybe it should be a job for guys that are at 30,
Yeah.
um, sometimes, at the time, I don't want to say there was problems with some of the aircraft carriers, but I mean, it's a big, huge job, man. I mean, you know how that goes. You've been
Mhm.
on one. Um, I mean, there's things that go on that people don't even know what the hell's going on over there. You know, the departments know and divisions know, but not everybody
Mhm.
knows, right? I mean, when you schedule captain's mass on a weekly basis or a biweekly basis, right? Think
It's a
about that for a
city.
second.
It's a
But
city,
but
man.
think about that for a second, right?
Yeah.
Everybody else schedule it as needed, right? Big decks like that schedule it every week. It's a placeholder,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. And I was on a big deck that had midnight mass. Man, my
There you
captain
go.
loved putting people in the brig, dude.
Ugh.
Loved it. And yeah, it is a big man. And you know what's funny is right about that time is when they changed the rule to where you could go over 30 years at an '06 command, right? Because before, right around that, they wouldn't let you do that. Then they changed it. I think it was where you can go over 30 years at an '06 command. Uh, so when you got the job to go to Guam, so first off, just so I understand, you wanted to put your name in the hat for an aircraft carrier, and they told you no, you couldn't even do it.
Yeah.
That's one of my biggest gripes about the program, or the Navy's senior listed management program, right? I believe that the boss should be the one that says yes or no to the candidates, right? And not some other master chief that's just like, nope, sorry, you're not the guy. Because what the hell? Like, when they changed that in the flag mess is when I really was like, I don't even care to even try for that process, bro. Because you got a bunch of other master chiefs playing freaking Game of Thrones back in wherever they're at in Virginia or something, and they're deciding who are the ones that got to go, and they're making people go places they don't even want to go. You
Yeah.
know?
I mean, once you get to that level, right? It's, and I don't want to say who you align yourself with, but a lot has to do with, the admiral you're working for at the time when he's a 2-star or a 1-star or a 3-star, right?
True.
And you know,
Look at the new McPon,
well,
right?
I yeah, it's just, I mean, but he's not the only. I mean, that's not the first opportunity, and,
Not
and
at
I
all.
Yeah,
Not at
no, and
all.
you
But
know, and great choice, by the way. It
mhm,
couldn't happen to a better couple, and I say
yeah,
couple because Angie, his wife, is fantastic.
right.
They're just a fantastic family. He's a fantastic Master Chief. Angie was my Fleet and Family Support Center domestic violence counselor at Pearl.
Nice.
So I actually interacted with her more than I did her husband at the time when he was in Pearl,
Yeah,
which
no,
is
no. I first
unfortunate.
met him.
Yeah,
I went out to Pack Fleet for a conference, and he was sub pack at the time, I think.
yeah.
Or maybe he was sub land, one of the two. But he was a submarine guy at the time, and we met. And solid dude. Don't get me wrong. Like, I think he's a great choice. It's like I think the Admiral's a great choice for CNO. I just think it's another reminder of when you get an admiral who really likes his senior enlisted leader, he'll just take them with him wherever they go. And
It's familiarity though. I mean, I understand it 100%. It's familiarity. It's about knowing each other's weaknesses and strengths and trust, right? You got to be able to count on somebody, and he's got that with him. And when it
yeah,
was announced that he was a CNO, I'm like, oh shit. I told my
everybody
wife, I
knew.
said, I
Eh,
said, John Perryman is going to be the next CNO. She goes, what, really?
Brother,
She's like,
everybody
I
knew.
thought
Everybody knew. People,
I
I
thought
was
there was.
talking to people from my little Ocala home base,
Yeah.
and I was like, "Who y'all think is the next big one?" They're like, "Gary, it's Perryman." Like, what are you thinking?
Yeah.
Look, I
I
just,
thought I, I thought JJ had an outside shot, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
JJ
Which
was like, I don't know. JJ had an outside shot if that one CNO hadn't got fired.
no, JJ still had out. I mean, he interviewed for the position. He didn't tell me he did, but he did. You
Oh,
know,
did he?
yeah, he did. And
Well, because that was his Sixth Fleet commander when he was out there. They were
yeah,
like
it
the freaking.
was.
They were an awesome team, bro.
Yeah.
So when
So,
JJ first got the orders to go to DC, I was like, "Oh, they're lining JJ up, man. He's about to be the guy."
well, it didn't hurt really that Master Chief Isom got selected for uh SEAC, right? Because
Yeah,
he's that dude is amazing, right? That
right.
dude is amazing, right? So once he got, selected as SEAC, there was nobody standing in, John Perryman's way at all.
Yeah,
Just based on how you line it up, right? How do you line it up? Well, you got to be a fleet master chief to be MCPON,
yeah.
right? They
What do
that
you think about
that's
that? Do you think that's important?
I think it's got some validity sometimes. What they call it? They call it the MCPON Campa rule now, which is kind of
I met Joe Campa at the Navy Ball. He came out to Sasbo, and
Mhm.
I made chief when he was the MCPON '06, and I bought into what he was saying, man. Hook,
Oh
line,
no,
and
no,
sinker.
he's a great guy. He
Yeah.
it upset some of the fleet master chiefs at the time. Really did.
And, I like innovators that disrupt, bro. I'm okay
Yeah.
with that. I'm a
So
chief. I'm
so
a
so am I.
chief,
Yeah, right?
right? I'm a
No,
chief. Get over
no, it's
yourself. I remember I was a seventh fleet. I was a staff CMC, and the seventh fleet CMC was on travel. And the boss had asked me to send emails to all the flag CMCs to get information. Right now, I'm the staff CMC, so my job is to take care of the staff. But again, the fleet CMC's on travel, and the 3-star asked me to send an email. Okay, well, I'm also on the email inbox of my fleet CMC because while he's on travel, I'm managing that. I'm helping him out, whatever, blah blah blah. Right, and the emails that came back to the fleet CMC from other master chiefs that were so petty and so immature. Who does Gary think he is telling us what to do? Blah, blah. Like, bro, I'm the guy in the room where the guy said to send the email, but we're all a bunch of master chiefs, dog. Like, get over yourself, bro. And I just, for me, that really, really, really just reminded me of how some people really can let things go to their head, even in the mess. Right. And
yeah, there's
now
a
those
pecking order,
people,
man. There's a
oh yeah,
pecking order.
I I guess they can have it, bro. They can have it.
Nah, there is. I mean, it is what it is, man. I mean,
Yeah.
and and,
So when you
and
were at Guam, how did you like that tour for you? Did you enjoy it?
I did actually. It's before COVID, so and had a fantastic group I worked with, right, in the office. Um, you know, Jeff Grimes was the cause at the time,
Yeah,
right? Fantastic leader, dude. You
great.
know,
I love that man,
fantastic
bro.
leader. Yeah, he's
I
he.
love that man. I would go to
Some
war for Jeff Grimes.
yeah, I had so much respect for him. Based upon what he had to juggle, um, right? Because he had to juggle two separate bosses from
Yep.
completely different stratospheres, right? And man, you had one who was not a people person, right?
Yeah.
And you had another one who was all about people, you know, and
I
and it,
understand.
wow, man, that's another
Yeah.
story that I almost got fired 2 days into my job.
No, I'll tell
And
you,
I,
Captain
hey,
Grimes.
hey, and I even talked to my force master chief about it because he
Yeah.
because he was because he was there at the time. Yeah, I was
Yeah.
like, man, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to make this week. And he looked at me and said, "You're gonna make it. Just know your place. This person is gonna be gone, and your boss is gonna be in charge in a week. So just it's a week.
Yeah.
Go on house hunting leave or something." He told me.
Yeah. Go out. No. Yeah. I, no, Jeff is phenomenal human being, man. I love that man. We went through it, man. He was my base CO at Guam and we had COVID. That was something else. But best guy for the job, right? Because he knew the island very well. He knew the laydown. He knew operational thinking. He had been Squadron 15, freaking Commodore, and then went to Marianas, then to MBG. Yeah, it was great.
It was crazy, I was kind of following a little bit, right? From afar. You know, I was like, man, there's nobody's in those hotels downtown. Just throw all
I
those
know.
and that's what happened, right? And it's like,
Brother,
wow, what a great,
trust me. Trust me. We were saying the same thing, but freaking, I will say the powers that be that we're 4 stars were being hard ass because they were like, we're war fighters. No, that's the Hilton. It's open. The Dusatani. It's open. Like, what if we're war fighters? I told this to somebody one time. I said, if we're war fighters and keep them on the ship and fight it from the sea, bro, don't bring them on my island when I only got 60 COVID beds for a whole island, right? But of course, deaf ears, right? Just make it work. And I don't, yeah, that leadership triangle right there. My heart went out to Jim because he was doing the best that he could do. He got roped into that whole thing once he went to Fifth Fleet. He was along for the ride too.
yeah, well, but it was
He
good,
was
man.
going with,
I enjoyed my time out there.
yeah,
And then I interviewed for a couple of jobs, didn't get them, and then just had to move on.
yeah. So what'd
Yeah.
you end up doing after you retired?
So I literally just I started working, man. I'm working at an internet company right now, doing HR and doing government contracting. So we provide internet to a lot of different places. Well, my focus is obviously the employees, but also getting government contracts. So we just closed out contracts that circuit. They went from China Lake Naval Air War Station to North Island Coronado, and
Wow.
then from China Lake to Beale. So we're on about 10 different military installations. And I liaison with them, and I'm able to talk a little bit of the language, to get in and get things done. But it's I still got 2 kids that are on the payroll, so I'm still working.
I can relate. I got an 11-year-old and I got a 17-year-old, and I'm a high school teacher now. Which is it really is great. It's everything I loved about being a chief petty officer without a lot of the other drama that comes along with it. I mean, there is drama. Don't get me wrong. Like literally high school drama. It's like there's drama, but it's just it was very refreshing to get to young people. As a CMC, unfortunately, you don't always get to be surrounded by the hard chargers. You're typically dealing with the people that are unfortunately taking advantage of the situation, and
Yeah.
you're the one that has to tell them the thing that nobody else is willing to say, right? Everyone else is afraid to say it, but someone's got to say it. And dude, you're malingering, or dude, I think you're taking advantage. We can't man the watch stations because you're not armed up, and you've only been in the Navy for a year and a half, brother. What are we doing, bro? Like,
Yeah, there's I tell you that there's nothing like being a you know Hayes Gray CMC, because you see everybody and that's your job, right? The higher
yeah,
you go, the further away you're from, sailors, you know,
that's
and
fact.
the more, don't get me wrong, our civilian employees, they're great too, but it's, we joined the Navy, to be around sailors, and
Yep,
then, being on a Navy base, CMC, that, there's a lot, what I like to say is there's, the dark secret, the secret of the Navy is that, go to your your temp due, or your limited duty office, or your TAD, whatever you want to call it, right? You've got a group of sailors there that are not deployable
it's a
for a
problem.
lot of different reasons, right?
Yep,
A lot of different reasons.
yep.
A lot of them are psychological, in my opinion, but that's anecdotal because I don't have those numbers. But when I was on base at Pearl, and when I was over in Guam, you're able to see what's wrong, right?
Yep.
What's wrong with them and how they're doing it. But
It was
that's
tough,
a
man, and
yeah.
pregnancies, a lot of pregnancies. That was another challenge. I had all these pregnant sailors working for me. We had to put a freaking nursing room in the like ID card office, like the remember on base and you come into
Hmm.
Guam, the driver license office, whatever it was. We literally had to put a nursing station in there because that we had so many pregnant females. And I remember talking to the captain and be like, "Sir, we're always talking about active shooters. That place is a target. In my personal opinion, it's outside the gates, and
Yeah.
I'm staffing them with pregnant sailors. And what the hell are we doing?" He was like, "Master Chief, what do you want me to do?" It's like, I don't know. I don't know. Like, what are we, I, the other thing is we talk about that. I had all those people that denied the COVID vaccination.
Mm.
Believe it or not, they came in so clutch in the fight against COVID because when everybody that was operational went back to work, I still had all those bubbas working for me because they didn't take the shot. And so they were still working, right? And they
Delivering
were
probably
happy to
delivering
work.
meals, probably, right?
Yeah, they were just doing whatever, right? But I just, we didn't have a lot of military personnel, and the civilians are only going to do so much, and we were getting tasked to do a bunch of things that were not in our skill set, and just leveraging what you got, right? Playing the hand that you're dealt, figuring it out, and I'd say to your other point, when I was a ship CMC, I really was a hesitant whenever somebody was going ashore to a doctor's appointment because you never knew if that was the last time you were going to have that sailor on
Mm.
board your ship. And that when I got to the states and I retired from the service, right? I'm in this school with these kids, which it's a rough area, bro. Like these kids are growing up in some tough spots, and they're tough. They're tough, bro. And I feel like there's a disconnect somewhere between where the sailor joins for whatever their reasons, and X amount of years later, and all of a sudden they're God forbid, I hope that I try not to get a disability check after only 3 years in the Navy. Like that's a bad plan, bro. Like that's
Mhm.
not it. But they're tapping out. And I don't know if it was because they already had the challenge or what. And then the other problem is with all the requirements to get in right now medically. When I talk to the recruiters out here, it's like they can't get people to be qualified, right? Because so many kids are diagnosed early with all these things that's all disqualifiers, or they got one of my cadets. He graduated a couple of years ago. It took him two almost 3 years after high school graduation to be off all his medications to be able to join the Navy, right? You got to really want that, bro, because a lot of people will lose track of that goal. They'll just drop it and go do something else, you
No,
know?
I mean, even when you're in, right? I mean, when I was a base CMC, right? I'd be the one that got notified, right? Hey, MA2 or
Yep.
MA3, blah blah blah,
Getting
went,
armed down.
these, yeah, and it's
Yep.
like who? So then I call over, the security and say, hey, blah 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 blah, what's your plan? Well, our plan is nothing yet. I thought, whoa, that's the wrong answer. Second answer is let's start that, like you said, you gotta you gotta disarm them. You can't put them
Yeah,
and then I want to report whether or not there's a firearm in the house.
yeah.
You know,
No,
and then
100%.
then you walk over to your boss, right? Knock on the door and say, "Hey, this is what's going on." Blah blah blah. He's like, "Huh? They went want
So,
to do anything,
Brian,
huh?"
let's talk about that real quick, bro, while we're wrapping this
Mhm,
thing up, because I think you would have an interesting perspective on this. Because I believe the United States Navy gets wrong force protection on installations,
mm,
right? We didn't have an MA force that was as big as it was before 9/11, right? And in the old days, surface sailors would do shore duty at installation security, right?
mhm,
And they would do the exact same rotation 3-2-2-3. There would be senior MAs that ran everything. But back in those days, you couldn't convert over to MA till you were E5 or above, right? Um, and then, of course, 9/11 happens and we just blow the MA force up 1,000%, right? The problem is, at least in my opinion, either A, there's not enough MAs because that rotation seems to be barely able to manage itself at 3 out 3 8 that 3-2-2-3 rotation. When I got there as a ship guy and I'm trying to figure out this rotation that my sailors are on, and all my DOC surveys are like they're all exhausted, they're all tired, they're on nights, they're getting called in, all these things, right? But then I
mhm.
find out every law enforcement agency like in the world does the same rotation. Even civilian cops do the same thing, right? But the difference is they don't have all the extra crap to deal with, all the HR stuff like the Navy does, right?
Sure. All
Captain's
the training.
calls and
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
all that stuff. I believe this is what Gary Wise thinks. If I had my way to make CNIC a better place for everybody in the world, I would put installation security and force protection under Navy Expeditionary Combatant Command, NECC, right? And I'd give
Mhm.
all the MAs to NECC because they already have a lot of the MAs from the Riverine group or from the harbor from like the EOD groups or whatever it is, because harbor security is the other challenge, right? We've got land based security, we've got harbor security, but harbor security is like 100% military. There's no civilian supplementation there at all. Okay, give it all to the NECC commander, give all the MAs to that person, and then make that person reportable to the installation commander for force protection instead of some freaking MALDO, who those guys are typically. I've met a few good ones, but I've met some other ones that were just freaking pistols, bro. They were just, you couldn't tell them nothing because they were very, very, very locked in on what they thought was the only way to do things. Or they need to, I mean, there's just not enough MAs. And if you look
Do
at
you
the
know do you know
Navy,
do you know an LDO that's not?
yeah, that's true. That's true. That's
And
true. That's
God bless
true.
them. That's you know.
Exactly, and that's their world, right? I was just visiting. I'm a surface sailor that's coming through. They've been doing installation security the majority of their career, right? Like, because if you join the Navy after 2002, 2003, and you made LDO in 10 years or whatever, you might have never even seen a real ship. You might have just done base security your whole time as an MA
Yeah.
because that can count for them as sea and overseas or whatever
Oh
that
yeah.
is.
You go to Guam, you go to Bahrain, you go to any numerous places. I'm only familiar with West Coast and Westpac and
Yeah.
that type of thing. So,
I
but
remember
I
being on Guam and talking to the CRG CMC, Coastal Riverine Group, right?
Mhm,
And he had a ton of MAs, but they wanted nothing to do with force protection because they were at CRG right now, right?
mhm,
Like, put them all together and split all the missions because they had really good ships that were like these Mark 7 ships that were really good ships. They could be out there doing harbor security. Me and Captain Grimes would be in there talking about it. We'd be so frustrated. Like, damn it, Master Chief, how come I can't get those in me? Because in his mind, he's a war fighter, right? He's like, that's
mhm.
not, it's, what do you think about that, man? Because I
Well,
think that the Navy has a force protection problem.
so this conversation has happened it was happening when I was even before base CMC and during my base CMC job, right? So I'm sure it's still happening. And I think the problem lies is what your primary war fighting responsibility is, right? And I think the argument for the expeditionary force to take that would almost be like 1A of their primary responsibility, right? Or even their top responsibility, depending on what threat is out there. Because you can remember the expeditionary force was kind of like Brown Navy stuff, right? That's why we got LCS. God forbid we didn't talk about that thing. This, but you know, but
I
it
can
was
tell
it
you a
was
story. I can
well,
tell
I
you a
have
story.
tons of stories, right?
Yeah,
And but I actually got a chance in my Port Royal deployment to ride up the KAA on a Iraqi patrol boat.
right.
And so we went into Iraq on our Iraqi patrol boat, and went up there for a day or two, almost 2 days, to go, to check out what we were doing because our mission was um, training the Iraqi security force, right? That was the mission, training the Iraqi security force. And we did it as a ship and as a coalition, hands on, to train them to defend their oil platforms,
Yep.
which was a mess. That's a whole nother
What year
topic
was
that
that?
I don't know. It's my last deployment,
Because I was there
2004
when it blew
maybe.
up. When KOP blew up, I was
Oh
out there.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That was
Yeah.
yeah, that
And
was
Port
before
Royal was
that.
out there then.
Yeah. So I'll tell you, I mean, that's an interesting, inherent resolve was the mission, right?
Yep.
Inherent resolve was a mission to train the Iraqi security force to turn
Yep.
it back over to them, but it was never going to work. It never did because they have different priorities, different life sets. They don't care about protecting something,
Yeah.
protecting land. They want they're we used to go over to oil platforms daily, right? We were over there. Um, and my first day, we specifically flew a month and a half before we went ahead of the ship to learn the mission. Me and the ops boss. And our first morning, we wake up after our long travel and flying
Yeah.
the bird out of the ship. We were on a British ship. Um, and we show up. The guy says, "All right, here's your 9 millimeter." And I say, "Oh, okay. Here's your clips, blah blah blah." And he goes, "Oh, I see you got an American flak jacket." I said, "Yep." He goes, "Take this one. It's better." And I said, "True, sounds good." He goes, "By the way, we're just going out to oil platforms, right?" He goes, "Yeah." He goes, "So can you explain why?" He goes, "Well, we don't know which way these guys are going to shoot their guns when we're doing these drills." I said, he goes, "The Iraqis." He goes, "The Iraqis were doing drills. They're firing freaking guns off this platform. We're doing training with them, and we
Yeah.
don't know which way. And sometimes if they turn around and start shooting, we don't know. So better you wear a flak jacket, maybe save your life, and you got a gun in case you got to shoot one." And
Yeah.
that was my first day on this deployment. I'm like, "Oh yeah, let's go."
No, I hear what you're saying when it comes to the warfighting mission, man. I just think that the other people I would like to see get installation security, the Marines, right? The United States Marine Corps used to have, or they used to do installation, force protection, and security, right? And I just don't think the United States Navy is meant to have an army, right? And the MA, when I look at these sailors that are struggling in the fleet, when I talk to people, a lot of them are shore-based MAs. Or unfortunately they're the ones of those high level, high security positions that are working with Marines protecting things, and those are also very stressful long years of your life that are going to be down a hole, right? And I just feel like if they could do anything to make the Navy better, again, I don't get a vote. I'm just saying, as a guy who tried to make it work on an installation, my MAs were just they were trying to make it work, and it was
Yeah.
tough math, man. There just wasn't enough of them.
I think that's the problem is there wasn't enough of them, because
Yeah,
they're all in rotation, right? You know,
a
and
lot
on
of
their day
games.
offs, yep, and on their
Lo-
day offs, they're doing whatever CBT we got, whatever CBT the CMC's jamming down their throat, you
For
know.
real. God,
Oh,
I
and
used to
then we're
feel
doing,
guilty
and then
about
we're
that
then we're
crap.
gonna then we're gonna do a captain's call on Friday, you know, and then next Thursday we're gonna have a CMC call, you know.
I used to, yeah. You know what? I would never, I wouldn't do it, man. I would purpose just not do it. Then I'd get in trouble. They'd say, "Well, CMC doesn't love us because he doesn't ever see us," and you're like,
Yeah. And then MCPON's coming next week,
"Yeah,
and then guess what? A week after CNL's coming, and then a week after that, Pack Fleet's coming. You know,
yeah."
we do it to
They all want to
ourselves,
say
man.
hi, and you got to fill the theater. You got to
Yeah,
fill the
we do it to
theater.
ourselves.
All right, here we go, bro. We're gonna wrap this thing up. Here, I'm gonna ask you some questions, and
All
just go
right,
ahead and hit me with your answers, okay?
all right.
All right. Do you remember when you had your like, oh my gosh, I'm in the Navy moment? Like, what was your welcome to the Navy? Like, I'm really in the freaking Navy now, bro. Like, wow.
So probably the first day on the ship.
Okay. That
First
frigate
day on the ship. Yeah, first day, first
going
night.
going down that extra long hallway
Yeah,
for you know what? That happens to so many people though that you learn that one way and that's your safety
that's
net,
it,
right?
man.
That's your egress route.
That's
Your route.
it.
That's it. All right. What do you see as being one of the biggest leadership challenges in the world today?
Hmm. I'd say probably the fortitude or the execution to do something and fail, right? Um, because to me, I mean, if you're avoiding stuff not to fail, or you're trying to, whatever reason, I think failure is okay, as long as it's mitigated by leadership. You know,
So people
um,
being afraid to take the chance because they might fail. Got it. That's
Yeah.
it,
So,
man.
but I mean, but leadership's got to be involved too a little bit, right? I mean, obviously there's some my Navy term, right? There's some ORM to be done, right? I mean, there's certain things you don't want to fail in, right? When lives are at stake, but it's okay to fail on some things that aren't as important.
Yeah, got it for sure. Uh, how can parents best leverage leadership skills while raising, especially teenagers? You know, I've got a lot of
Mm.
kids I work with that are teenagers that actually they listen to the show, they enjoy the conversations because I think they like the fact that I'm the same person with you guys as I am with them, right? It doesn't change. And then, of course, their parents also pay attention and listen. And I think people are always trying to worry about how to best raise their kids. I think leadership has a seat at that table. You've raised adult children now. What do you
Yeah.
think about that?
So one of the first things that I still tell them to this day, but no, is never be a victim. You know, you're in control of your destiny, or at least you're in control of how you try to get there. You know, don't be one that says, "Oh, I can't get there because I'm a female. Oh, I can't get there because I'm Mexican. Oh, I can't get there because I'm white. Oh, I can't get there because I'm X color," right?
Yeah.
Or, I mean, I mean, I love the Navy because it gave me opportunity regardless of who I was or where I came from, how I spoke, up to a certain point, right? I mean, the higher you get, you got to be able to talk sometimes, right? But they just wanted, you know, the, as a leader in the Navy, I didn't see color, I didn't see sex. Are you able to execute and do the job, and are you trainable to do that job,
Yeah.
right? Because you might not be as fluent or as skilled as somebody else right now, but we can get you there. But are you able to get her? You know, but to me, victimhood right now in our society is pretty high, at probably
Yep.
the highest level I've ever seen it. And I've always told both my kids, right? Don't play those cards. You're not going to play them at home. We're not going to play them anywhere.
Yep.
Um, you know,
No, I tell the students like one same thing I told the sailors, which is you can't always control what someone else is going to do, but you can control how you respond, right? And if you respond out of character or out of a manner that you're proud of, that's no one's fault but yourself, and you gotta own that. So I think you're spot on, brother. Okay, here's one for you. What's a piece of advice you would give to somebody who's struggling within an organization? It's that chief that feels like they didn't get the eval they thought they were going to get, or it's this young professional who feels like they're not getting the opportunities that they thought they're going to get after college. What would you give them as advice for that handling that struggle?
First thing I do is tell them to look in the mirror, you know, and do an honest assessment of what really is what's real, right? A lot of times, you know, people perceive being wronged, right? This is victimhood I'm talking about. Um, Unfortunately, there's bad leaders out there though too, and there's bad supervisors that you know that 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 aren't doing right things for their peer or their subordinates and able to excel, right? But I'd say that one, you got to first look in the mirror and take muster of basically what's what, right? What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? What do I have to do? And then have that conversation with people, that person, right? Or people that can make a difference or holding you back, which you perceive, right?
Yeah.
And hopefully that person has an honest conversation. Sometimes you don't get those honest conversations, you know, and that's in every organization, whether it be the military or civilian. Life is not fair, Gary. You know that.
Yeah.
You know, you got to make the best out of what you got going. And if somehow it's detrimental to you as a person, then maybe you need to seek other opportunities, maybe,
Yep.
you know.
Facts. Good stuff, brother. Uh, how can veterans best leverage their experience when they transition into the civilian world?
Oh my goodness. I used to help out some folks doing resumes and things like that. Um, you know, Unfortunately, I don't want to say I stopped doing it, but less people seem to be more interested in it or not, which is it's unfortunate. I think it's unfortunate. I mean, today I've gone through over 150 resumes because I'm trying to hire some folks, right? And my HR hat, right? So I see what's what, and I see how people stand out and how people it's eval writing, right? That's
Mhm.
all it is. How do you get selected for chief? How do you select for senior chief? Oh, it's master chief. You know, you gotta leverage those places sometimes, or leverage people um, that have gone through it, or have looked at a lot of resumes or a lot of opportunities to get to places, right? To me, that's kind of what I would say.
I mean, the years of experience they got is value added, and I'll tell you, be on this side of the transition from retirement. I I'm very good. I love what I did in the Navy. I'm glad I did my 25 years, but I'm also glad that I transitioned when I did because it's nice to have that pressure of that impending transition no longer in the way and being able to focus on the life after. You know, do you think that the Navy should retire us or that the armed forces should retire us at that 30-year mark, bro, if you're physically fit and capable to do the job? Because I think they would have got a lot of us to stay a lot longer if they didn't just say you have to go to pasture at 49 years old or whatever.
I think that there should be an avenue, right? And I like the fact that and I don't know what the new guidelines are, right? As far as when you can leave or what. I just know, that what I was, right? At 30, you had to get a flag job, right? I think there's some opportunities for some folks, and especially since well, when I was in uh the percentage of people applying and being selected for CMC was considerably down. It was down almost 60%. I don't
Yeah,
know what the numbers are now, but it was down. Um, and it's because, the job is hard. And if you fail at the job, um, you're most likely, packing it up, you
yeah.
know,
The pay is
and
garbage. The pay is
Yeah,
garbage, bro. Let's be
yeah,
honest.
absolutely.
The pay
So
is
so
garbage, bro. The
yeah,
department heads get $100,000 sign-on bonus, and we go into the program for a freaking measly little SDIP, whatever you want to call it, and we always have the cell phone. You know what I'm saying?
yeah.
It's garbage. But again, that's really, do you really respect that talent or not? Because let's be honest, the way you show you respect your talent is by how you pay them or compensate them for taking on that level of risk. People that go in the Command Mastery program, unfortunately, the Command CNC program, while I applaud the idea, I don't know. We're retired now, right? But I've got my opinions for sure. I
No,
feel
no,
like
I agree. I agree. Like, out here in the civilian world, we've got to pay the guys that are the guys we need, right?
yeah,
Retraining, rehiring people, it's not a it's not a good position to fight anything, right?
yep,
So yeah, I've always thought that the stress level of CMCs, uh, particularly the gray hull, those that are, on ships or aircraft or in debts or anything that's deployable, right?
yeah.
Um, is very stressful
And I would put it
and
across
not
all the
compensated.
branches, right? Whether you're Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, doesn't matter. I, and I understand the whole retirement thing, but I think that they should be giving them sign-on bonuses that are significant, at least
Right.
to come into the program, period. But they don't. Whatever. All right, here we go. It is Friday night or Saturday night. We're on the ship, bro. Are you looking forward to the pizza or the wings?
Oh, the wings.
All right. I need somebody in the berthing or I need somebody in the working party. Which one do you want?
Oh my goodness. It depends. It depends. If it was Seaman Ortega, it'd be the birthing. If it was CMC Ortega, I'd be the working party because you know what? I've been known to get on a working party as CMC and
Hell
as senior
yeah.
chief and tugging those lines for
Yeah.
unreps.
100%, man. No, I get it. I respect both places, man. The berthing needs to be clean too. That's just how it needs to be. All right. We're going to watch a movie in the mess. Would you rather watch De Niro or Pacino?
Mm, Pacino.
Pacino. Okay. Hey, looking back on your career, I think I know the answer to this. But what was your favorite duty station?
Why?
Yeah. Looking back on your career, what was your favorite Liberty port?
Ooh, good question. Good question. Maybe Thailand, Philippines.
Those are both great choices.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. All right. Looking back on your career, what was the hardest qualification you ever had to earn?
Probably TAO
That's a big
or
one.
maybe CDO. CDO.
Okay. Okay. How about if you had the chance to give somebody advice, would you recommend they go overseas or stateside?
Go to a hard job.
Go to a hard job. Check.
That'd be my mistake. Yep. And for the Navy, for us guys, it'd be something gray.
Yeah. Yep. Go to a USS, baby. Do you have a favorite movie series?
Ooh. Yeah, I think I do. I'm gonna go with Stranger Things.
That's a great. I love that show. I wish they've taken a long break though. Okay, I like Strange. I love the nostalgia of it too. It's a great TV series.
Yeah, it's the
All right,
'80s, man. That's my book. That's my line, man.
I love it. I love it for sure. Okay, would you rather be independent or on a team?
Team.
Okay. Do you have a personal leadership philosophy?
I do. I do. It's just pretty basic, and it's you know how big or how hard is your give a shit factor.
That's it. Keep it simple, bro. All
Yeah.
right. So in the Navy Chiefs mess, we have deck plate leadership, institutional technical expertise, professionalism, character, loyalty, active communication, or sense of heritage? Well, those were our guiding principles there. Which one of those is your favorite?
I don't know if any of them was my favorite, to tell you the truth. I mean, maybe
Okay.
deck plate leadership, you know?
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you gotta lead, right? It's
Yeah.
just gotta lead.
Yeah. So I've that's my favorite as well. But I appreciate the answer for sure. All right, brother. Would you rather lead or follow?
Oh, definitely lead.
All right, man.
But
That's
but
it,
I'm
Brian.
okay with following too, though.
I get it. All right, man. You got any save rounds or alibis?
Nah, no save rounds. Thanks for having
All
me,
right.
though.
Thank you for joining me, brother. I appreciate you taking your time, sharing your story. Hopefully, everybody enjoys it. If you're listening to the sound of our voice, like, subscribe, do all the things. Thank you very much. Hey, man, I appreciate you, Brian.
It's good.
And I know I was born for this. I know I was born for this. Don't care for the critics, my words are like physics, a force that they can't stop. They just don't get it, I think they forget I'm not done till I'm on top. I know I was born for this. I know